air storm. The icy drops soaked through my thin coat, but the real freeze was coming from the other side of the reinforced glass door. There stood Victoria, my daughter. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the one I had worked 40 years in construction to provide for. Now she stood with her arms crossed, looking at me, not with love or even pity, but with absolute disgust. Her voice pierced through the howling wind, cutting deeper than any physical wound ever could. She looked me dead in the eye and said the words that would shatter my entire world. "This house is mine now. You are just a useless old man dirtying my living room rug. Go rot in your dead wife's garbage farm." I wiped the rain from my eyes, trying to see if this was some kind of sick nightmare. But the cold, hard reality was staring right back at me. The $8 million mansion behind her, the very home my life savings had helped secure, was now her fortress against me. The chandeliers glowed warmly inside, casting a mocking light on my soaked, shaking hands. How did it come to this? How does a father go from being the hero of the story to a piece of trash thrown out in a midnight storm? I could see the expensive Persian rug she was so worried about me dirtying. A rug I paid for. A living room I helped renovate. My heart pounded against my ribs. Just 3 days ago, we buried my wife Diane. My soul was already bleeding from losing the woman I loved for 40 years, and now my own flesh and blood was tearing the rest of my heart to pieces. If you are watching this right now, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in my own family. If you have ever sacrificed everything for your children, working endless shifts, destroying your own body just to give them a better life, only to be met with utter contempt and betrayal, then I need you to hit the like button right now. Please leave a comment and tell me which state or country you are watching from. It brings a little warmth to this old man's heart to know that I am not alone in this dark world and to see where my story is reaching. You might think you know the people you raised. You might think your unconditional love will buy their loyalty when you grow old and weak. But trust me, what I found later that night at that so-called garbage farm will give you absolute chills. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to leave your jaw on the floor. Before I could even process Victoria's cruel words, a shadow moved behind her in the grand foyer. It was Derek, my son-in-law. He stepped up to the doorway, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt, with a smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his handsome face. He did not look at me like a grieving father-in-law. He looked at me like a nuisance, like a stray dog that had wandered onto his immaculate property. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of rusted, jagged keys. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed them out into the rain. They hit the wet marble and skittered down the steps, stopping right next to my soaked boots. Those belong to the farm. He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You are going to need them. Then he shoved the heavy glass door open, just a few inches, just enough to thrust a damp, folded piece of paper and a sleek silver pen into my face. What is this? I asked, my voice trembling from the cold and the sheer shock of the betrayal. Do not make this harder than it has to be, George, he sighed, rolling his eyes as if I were a stubborn toddler. It is just a standard release form. Sign this to get your name off the utility bills and the property taxes. Let us save us both the headache of dealing with the lawyers. You are in no condition to manage this massive estate anyway. My mind was a thick fog. The grief of losing Diane just 72 hours ago had left me utterly numb. I had not slept. I had barely eaten. Every bone in my 76-year-old body ached with a sorrow so deep it felt like I was drowning. I looked at the paper, but the rain and my own tears blurred the ink. I could not read the fine print. I just wanted to get out of the freezing storm. I wanted to wake up from this nightmare. I trusted my family. Why would not I? After all, Victoria was my only child, the center of my universe since the day she was born. I gave her everything she ever asked for, paying for her elite education, her luxurious wedding, and the very ground she was standing on. So with shaking frozen fingers, I took the pen and I signed my name on the dotted line. Derek snatched the paper back so fast he almost tore it. His smirk widened into a triumphant grin. "Have a nice retirement, George," he whispered. And with a heavy, sickening thud, the reinforced glass door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked, locking me out of my own life. I stood there in the pouring rain, clutching the rusted keys to a rundown farm, while my daughter and her husband walked back into the warmth of the mansion I paid for. I did not know it yet, but that piece of paper was not for the utility bills. That signature was the key to my total destruction. But it was also the beginning of my revenge. A revenge that would cost them everything they held dear. I stood on the curb for 20 minutes before a rusty sedan pulled up its headlights, cutting through the relentless downpour. The Uber driver, a tired-looking kid chewing gum, did not even offer to help with my metal suitcase. I heaved it into the trunk myself, the effort sending a sharp ache through my lower back, and climbed into the damp vinyl back seat. The car smelled intensely of stale smoke and cheap pine air freshener. As the tires peeled away from the sprawling gated estates of Bel Air, I leaned my head against the cold, foggy window. The rhythmic thumping of the broken windshield wipers felt like a countdown, ticking away the last remnants of the life I once knew. My mind inevitably drifted back to just 12 hours earlier. The mahogany-paneled conference room at the lawyer's office felt suffocating. We were gathered to read Diane's will. My beautiful Diane. She had always managed our finances, possessing a mind sharper than a steel trap. When the lawyer read the distribution of assets, my heart had skipped a beat. The $8 million estate, our primary residence, was left outright to Victoria and Derek. To me, her husband of 40 years, she left a barren, abandoned plot of land in the high desert that we affectionately called the garbage farm. I had been stunned into silence. Seeing my confusion, Victoria had immediately leaned across the polished table, placing her perfectly manicured hand over my rough, calloused one. Her eyes brimmed with what I thought were genuine tears. "Dad, you are 76 years old," she had whispered, her voice thick with fake sympathy. "That massive house has way too many stairs. It is just too dangerous for you to live there alone." Mom knew what she was doing. She left you the farm so you could have a quiet, peaceful retirement away from the noise of the city. We will take care of the big house and we will come visit you all the time. It sounded so reasonable. It sounded like the loving concern of a devoted daughter. In my grief-stricken state, my mind desperately wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that my wife was protecting me and that my daughter was looking out for my best interests. It was the perfect, plausible lie, and I had swallowed it whole. But sitting in the back of this pathetic, rattling car, the illusion dissolved into the bitter reality of the storm outside. I am George Caldwell. I spent 40 long, grueling years as a commercial construction engineer. My hands built half the high-rises dotting the Los Angeles skyline. I did not sit behind a desk pushing paper. I stood on steel beams, hundreds of feet in the air, breathing in dust and concrete, sacrificing my knees and my back so my family would never know the sting of poverty. I worked 80-hour weeks so Victoria could attend the finest private schools, wear the best clothes, and drive a brand new car on her 16th birthday. When she married Derek, I was the one who handed them the keys to their future. My sweat, my blood, and my broken joints paid for the very foundation they now stood upon. And this was my reward. Tossed out into the freezing rain like a bag of rotting garbage, humiliated by the very people whose lives I financed. The sheer disrespect burned in my chest, a hot, suffocating fire that threatened to consume whatever was left of my broken heart. A man builds his whole life to be a provider, a protector, a pillar for his family to lean on when the world gets tough. To have that stripped away, to be looked at with absolute disgust by your own child, is a pain that defies human language. It is a fundamental betrayal of the natural order. They did not just take my home tonight. They took my dignity. They reduced a proud, hard-working man to a shivering beggar holding a ring of rusted keys. I closed my eyes, trying to suppress the rising tide of anger and sorrow, but the image of Derek's smug face kept flashing in my mind. The way he tossed those keys, the way he forced that pen into my hand while I was still mourning the love of my life. They thought I was finished. They thought I was just a weak, senile old fool who would quietly fade away into the dust. But 40 years on a construction site teaches you a few things about resilience. It teaches you that when a structure collapses, you do not just cry over the rubble. You assess the damage, you find the weak points, and you rebuild. The city lights of Los Angeles slowly faded behind us, replaced by the endless, suffocating darkness of the highway heading toward the Mojave Desert. The rain finally stopped, but the atmosphere inside the car grew even heavier. There were no streetlights out here, only the weak yellow beams of the Uber's headlights cutting through the thick black void. The deeper we drove into the desolate landscape, the more an undeniable sense of dread began to wrap around my throat. The silence was absolute, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional rumble of a passing freight truck. We were miles away from civilization, completely isolated. Staring out into the pitch-black desert, my mind began to churn with dangerous questions. Why was Derek so eager to get my signature tonight? Why the sudden, brutal eviction? My wife was a brilliant forensic accountant. She never did anything without a meticulously calculated reason. Leaving me a worthless piece of desert land while giving them an $8 million asset made absolutely no sense, unless I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. My chest tightened. Something was terribly wrong. And the very first major terrifying realization of the long night was about to hit me. The rusted Uber sedan began to sputter slightly as we navigated a particularly desolate stretch of the highway. Up ahead, a flickering neon sign broke the heavy darkness, casting a sickly green glow over the wet asphalt. The driver muttered something under his breath and pulled into the glowing oasis. It was an isolated, rundown gas station, the kind that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Dust swirled around the cracked concrete pumps, and the fluorescent lights inside the small convenience store buzzed with an irritating mechanical hum. The driver put the car in park and announced he needed to fill the tank, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the back seat. My head was throbbing with a relentless, sharp pain, a cruel mix of exhaustion, grief, and the sheer shock of the night's events. Every joint in my body ached, a harsh reminder of my age and the toll 40 years of hard labor had taken on my bones. I needed water. I desperately needed some strong painkillers if I was going to survive the rest of this miserable journey. I pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the biting desert wind. The chill cut right through my damp clothes. I walked slowly toward the glass doors of the station, the bell chiming a hollow, lonely sound as I entered. The store was empty save for a bored-looking cashier with tired eyes staring blankly at a small television mounted in the corner. Rows of brightly colored snacks and dusty shelves seemed to mock the absolute despair churning in my stomach. I made my way to the back cooler, grabbed a plastic bottle of water, and picked up a small packet of over-the-counter painkillers from the front display counter. I placed the items on the scratched counter. The cashier rang them up without making eye contact, mumbling the total price. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my wallet. It was a worn leather bifold, a beautiful gift from Diane many years ago. Seeing it brought a fresh wave of agony to my chest, but I pushed the emotion down. I pulled out my primary credit card, a premium tier account I had maintained in perfect financial standing for over 2 decades. I slid the plastic through the card reader. The machine processed for a moment, the small screen flashing a bright, piercing message. Declined. I frowned, a sudden seed of confusion planting itself in my tired mind. I politely asked the cashier to try it again, assuming it was a simple reading error or a glitch in the outdated machine. He sighed, took the card from my hand, and wiped the magnetic strip on his shirt before swiping it a second time. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. declined. A cold sensation began to spread from the center of my chest, completely independent of the freezing desert air outside. I reached back into my wallet, my fingers suddenly feeling clumsy and numb. I pulled out my secondary card, an emergency backup I kept specifically for unexpected situations. I handed it to the cashier, forcing a strained, apologetic smile. He swiped the backup card. The machine beeped that exact same sickening tone. Declined. The cashier looked up at me for the first time, his expression shifting from boredom to mild suspicion. He handed the card back, shaking his head slowly. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. My breath caught in my throat. Panic, sharp and metallic, began to rise in my throat. I had one final card, a debit card directly linked to my massive retirement savings account. The account where I had deposited every bonus, every overtime check, every hard-earned dollar from 40 years of building skyscrapers. I fumbled to retrieve it, my hands visibly shaking now. I inserted the chip into the reader. The screen flashed instantly. Account locked. Contact your banking institution. The neon lights overhead seemed to dim, and the humming noise of the refrigerators grew into a deafening roar in my ears. I stumbled backward, leaving the water and the pills on the counter, and pushed my way out the glass doors. I collapsed against the cold brick wall of the gas station, gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the world. My 40-year engineer's intuition, the logical, analytical part of my brain that solved complex structural problems, suddenly slammed the puzzle pieces together with violent, unforgiving force. The damp, folded paper Derek had thrust into my face in the rain. The document he casually called a standard release form to get my name off the utility bills. I had signed it without reading the fine print, blinded by grief and absolute desperation. It was not a utility release. It was a general power of attorney. They did not just evict me from my own home tonight. They had legally authorized themselves to access every single financial asset attached to my name. While I was standing shivering in the freezing storm, waiting for a cheap ride to a deserted farm, Derek and Victoria were sitting in the warmth of the mansion I bought them, draining my entire life savings. They had wiped out the checking accounts. They had liquidated the mutual funds. They had stolen the retirement money I had bled for. They had deliberately orchestrated this exact moment, ensuring I would be completely powerless, penniless, and stranded in the middle of nowhere. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, bringing me to my knees on the dirty concrete. I was not just an unwanted father anymore. I was a victim of a calculated, ruthless financial slaughter executed by the very daughter I had loved more than life itself. I slowly forced myself off the freezing cold, dirty concrete, my knees trembling with every agonizing ounce of effort it took to stand upright. The wind howled around the desolate gas station, mocking my sudden destitution. I had nothing. No water, no painkillers, and not a single dollar to my name. I finally walked back to the waiting Uber, the cold rain beginning to mist again, clinging to my hair and face like cold sweat. The driver was already behind the wheel, tapping his fingers impatiently against the steering column. I opened the door and collapsed into the vinyl seat, closing my eyes as a profound silence settled between us. He looked at me through the rearview mirror, probably noticing my pale ghost-like complexion, but he did not ask any questions. He simply shifted the car into drive and pulled back onto the pitch-black desert highway. To break the suffocating silence, he reached for the dashboard and turned up the radio. It was a late-night financial news station, the kind that usually droned on about market closures and commodity prices. The steady, monotonous voice of the broadcaster filled the damp cabin, blending with the rhythmic thrum of the engine. I tried to tune it out, my mind still reeling from the devastating blow of my locked bank accounts, but then a specific name pierced through the static and grabbed me by the throat. The broadcaster shifted to a breaking news segment. In corporate news tonight, the Securities and Exchange Commission has officially opened a probe into the prominent Los Angeles-based real estate hedge fund, Vanguard Properties, operated by CEO Derek Lawson. Rumors have circulated for months regarding severe liquidity issues within the firm. Anonymous sources close to the investigation allege massive corporate fraud, pointing to millions of dollars in hidden liabilities and falsified collateral used to secure unregulated loans. The agency suspects the firm is facing imminent insolvency, with potential federal indictments looming on the horizon for its top executives. The young driver reached forward to change the channel, muttering something under his breath about boring rich people problems, but I gasped loudly and ordered him to leave it alone. He froze, startled by the sudden fierce authority in my voice. He lowered his hand and let the broadcast continue. The reporter detailed how Vanguard Properties had aggressively over-leveraged its position in a massive smart city development project, borrowing heavily from questionable offshore syndicates. If the firm could not produce substantial immediate capital to cover their margins by the end of the fiscal quarter, they would face total foreclosure and a brutal criminal trial. The broadcast concluded with a warning that investors should expect a complete freeze on the company's assets by the end of the week. The radio faded back into a commercial break, but the damage was done. The sound of the broadcaster's voice echoed over and over in the cramped space of the vehicle. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a violent, sickening clarity. Derek was drowning in a dark, bottomless ocean of catastrophic debt. He was not just a successful businessman going through a rough patch. He was a desperate criminal standing on the edge of a federal prison sentence. The sudden brutal eviction tonight had absolutely nothing to do with me being an inconvenience or a burden. It had nothing to do with the stairs in the Bel Air mansion being dangerous for an old man. That was all a meticulously crafted theatrical lie designed to get me out of the way. They needed total, unquestioned control of my assets to cover his massive financial crimes. They needed the millions I had saved over 40 years of breaking my back on construction sites to plug the gaping, bleeding holes in his fraudulent company. Victoria knew everything. My own daughter, the child I had protected and provided for her entire life, was fully complicit in this slaughter. She had sat right next to me at the lawyer's office that very morning, squeezing out fake tears, playing the role of the concerned, loving daughter, while secretly plotting to leave me penniless and stranded in the desert. They forced me to sign that general power of attorney because they needed immediate access to my retirement funds to fend off the federal investigators and the offshore syndicates breathing down Derek's neck. They threw me out into the rain like a stray dog so they could steal my life's work without me asking any questions. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was staggering. It was not just greed. It was absolute sociopathic malice. They were willing to sacrifice my survival, my health, and my dignity to save their own miserable, corrupt skins. As the Uber continued its lonely trek deeper into the barren Mojave landscape, the crushing weight of despair that had been suffocating me slowly began to transform. The sorrow and the heartbreak of losing my daughter to such vile corruption burned away, leaving behind something entirely different. A cold, hardened, unbreakable fury. I was George Caldwell. I had spent my entire life building foundations that could withstand earthquakes, hurricanes, and the test of time. I knew how to bear weight. I knew how to endure pressure. And I knew exactly how to tear a rotten structure down to the ground. They thought they had outsmarted a grieving, senile old fool. They thought they had safely discarded me in a wasteland where no one could hear me scream. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had taken my money, but they had not taken my mind. And as the dark silhouette of the dilapidated farm finally appeared in the distance, I made a silent, sacred vow to my late wife. I would find whatever Diane had left for me in this barren place, and I would return to Los Angeles, not as a broken victim, but as the architect of their absolute and total destruction. They would pay dearly for this unforgivable absolute betrayal. The rusted Uber sedan finally slowed down its tires, crunching loudly against a badly damaged gravel driveway. The headlights swept across a landscape that looked like it had been entirely abandoned for decades. The driver threw the car into park, the engine idling with a rough, uneven cough. "We are here," he announced quietly, pointing toward the darkness beyond the windshield. He did not ask for his fare, likely having been prepaid by Derek through the ride app to ensure I was dumped precisely at this miserable location. I opened the heavy door and stepped out into the biting desert wind. The driver popped the trunk, and I pulled out my cold metal suitcase. Before I could even turn around to thank him, the car was already reversing its red taillights, fading quickly into the oppressive black void of the Mojave night. I was entirely alone. I stood there for a long moment, letting my tired eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon finally broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a pale, ghostly light over the property. It was exactly as Victoria had mocked during the reading of the will. The place was an absolute ruin. Chest-high weeds choked the entire front yard, their dry, thorny stalks scratching against my damp trousers as I forced my way up the long-forgotten path. The perimeter fence was nothing but a series of rotting wooden posts leaning at impossible angles, the rusted wire sagging heavily into the mud. The smell of the place was overwhelming. It was a thick, suffocating stench of mildew, wet dirt, and total abandonment. My boots sank into the muddy ground, with every step making the short walk to the main structure feel like a grueling marathon. Looming ahead of me was the barn. It looked like a stiff desert wind could knock it over at any second. The wooden siding was heavily warped and stripped of whatever paint it once possessed, leaving the old boards gray and splintering. The roof sagged deeply in the middle, missing dozens of shingles, looking like the spine of a starved animal. This was the magnificent inheritance my late wife had supposedly left for me to enjoy my peaceful retirement, a literal garbage farm in the middle of a barren wasteland. I dragged my heavy suitcase onto the small, unsteady wooden porch, the floorboards groaning loudly in protest under my weight. I leaned against the damp wall, my chest heaving, as exhaustion threatened to pull me under. My entire body ached from the freezing cold, the lingering dampness, and the crushing betrayal of the last few hours. Victoria's cruel words echoed in the empty space around me. She had looked so disgusted by my presence, so eager to banish me to this decaying hellhole. They thought this isolated place would finally break me. They thought a penniless old man would just curl up in the dirt and wait for the end. But the bitter wind blowing through the broken window frames only fueled the angry fire that had ignited in my chest during that car ride. I was not going to die out here. I was going to survive. I took a deep breath of the damp, mildewed air and decided I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before the morning sun came up. I left my suitcase on the creaking porch and began to carefully walk the perimeter of the decaying barn. As a man who spent 40 years constructing high-rise buildings, I have a deeply ingrained habit of inspecting structural foundations. I walked slowly around the exterior, running my calloused hands along the rotting wood, feeling the deep ridges of decay. The back of the barn was even worse than the front, shrouded in the deep shadows of several massive dead oak trees that surrounded the property line. I navigated carefully through the dense, overgrown brush, trying to avoid stepping in the deeper mud puddles. I reached the far corner of the structure and stopped to catch my breath, leaning against the thick trunk of the largest dead oak. As I stood there staring out into the pitch-black desert, something unexpected caught my attention. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible gleam of light. It was not a reflection from the moon. It was a faint, steady red glow hidden perfectly within the hollowed-out section of the dead tree trunk, about 8 feet off the ground. I narrowed my eyes, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. I stepped back, squinting through the darkness. The red light shifted slightly, tracking my movement, with a quiet mechanical whir that was barely audible over the wind. I felt a sudden sharp chill run down my spine. That was not a piece of trash caught in the branches. That was a lens. I moved closer, using my height to peer into the dark hollow of the tree. My breath caught in my throat. Tucked securely inside the rotting wood, shielded from the rain and the elements, was a state-of-the-art, military-grade infrared security camera. It was hardwired directly into the trunk, its cables concealed beneath the thick, dead bark. This was not the kind of equipment you buy at a local hardware store to keep teenagers off your lawn. This was high-level, extremely expensive surveillance technology designed to be invisible to the naked eye. My engineering mind raced, calculating the implications. A sudden wave of adrenaline washed away my exhaustion. The puzzle shifted again. Why would anyone install a $10,000 security system to monitor a rotting wooden barn surrounded by weeds? You do not put a bank vault door on a garbage dumpster. Unless the garbage is just an illusion. Unless this decaying, mildew-smelling nightmare was deliberately designed to look like worthless garbage to keep people away. Diane had not left me a worthless piece of land. My brilliant wife was hiding something incredibly valuable right under this dirt. I stepped away from the hollowed-out oak tree, my mind racing with 100 different theories. I navigated back through the dense, wet brush, returning to the front of the dilapidated barn. The wind was picking up again, whipping the tall weeds around my legs, but I hardly felt the cold anymore. The adrenaline coursing through my veins had awakened every nerve ending in my body. I walked up to the large, sagging wooden double doors of the barn. Hanging from a heavy iron latch was a thick, rusted padlock that looked like it had not been touched in 50 years. I reached into my damp coat pocket and pulled out the ring of rusted keys Derek had so arrogantly tossed at my feet back in Bel Air. My fingers were stiff from the freezing rain, but I managed to find a heavy brass key that looked like a match. I slid the jagged metal into the base of the padlock. It resisted at first, grinding against decades of grit and corrosion, but with a firm, determined twist of my wrist, the internal mechanism clicked. The heavy lock popped open in my hand. I pulled it free and let it drop onto the muddy wooden porch. I grabbed the iron latch and pulled with all my remaining strength. The massive wooden doors groaned in protest, their rusted hinges shrieking loudly against the quiet desert night. I expected to be greeted by the suffocating stench of rotting hay, animal waste, and decades of accumulated dust. I expected to step onto a soft, unstable dirt floor. But as the wooden doors swung outward, revealing the interior shadows, my breath caught in my throat. What lay behind that decaying wooden facade was not a barn at all. Just 2 feet inside the threshold, completely concealed from the outside world, stood a secondary barrier. It was a massive drop-forged steel door seamlessly integrated into a reinforced concrete frame. The surface of the door was smooth and cold, painted a matte gray that absorbed the faint moonlight filtering in from outside. It looked like the entrance to a subterranean military bunker or a high-security bank vault. My eyes traveled across the imposing metal surface until they landed on a sleek black panel mounted at eye level. A small, glowing red laser swept back and forth across a glass lens. A retinal scanner. Just beneath it, a pristine, illuminated digital keypad glowed with a soft blue light. The contrast was absolutely jarring. Outside was a rotting, worthless shell of a building completely ignored by the world. Inside was a piece of impenetrable high-tech engineering that must have cost an absolute fortune to install. Diane had built a fortress, and she had hidden it right in the middle of nowhere. I stood frozen in front of the illuminated keypad, staring at the soft blue numbers glowing in the dark. My hands began to tremble, not from the biting desert wind, but from the overwhelming realization of what my wife had orchestrated. Diane was a master of secrets. As a forensic accountant, she spent her entire career untangling complex webs of hidden assets and corporate deception. She knew exactly how to conceal things from prying eyes, but she also knew that I would be the one standing here eventually. She would have left a way in for me. The retinal scanner was useless, likely programmed only for her eyes, but the keypad offered a chance. I closed my eyes and thought about my brilliant, beautiful wife. What sequence of numbers would she trust to guard her greatest secret? It had to be something deeply personal, something etched into the very core of our shared life. And then it hit me with a wave of profound, agonizing irony. Diane was meticulous with her professional security, but in her personal life she always used the exact same sequence for her most private safes and accounts. It was the date that had brought us the most joy, the day our family was made whole. It was Victoria's birthday. The very daughter who had just thrown me out into the street stripped me of my dignity and stolen my life savings. Her birth date was the key to this impenetrable vault. My fingers shook violently as I raised my hand toward the glowing panel. I took a deep, ragged breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to blur my vision. Slowly, deliberately, I punched in the 6 digits. Month, day, year. The soft electronic tone of the keypad registered each press. When I hit the final number, the blue light flashed green. A heavy, resonant mechanical clank echoed from deep within the steel frame, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my boots. Then came the unmistakable sound of pressurized air releasing. A sharp hydraulic hiss broke the silence of the desert night. The massive drop-forged steel door shuddered slightly, disengaging its heavy internal locking bolts. Smoothly, and with almost terrifying silence for its immense size, the door began to glide open on a hidden motorized track. A rush of pristine climate-controlled air washed over my face, completely devoid of the mildew and decay that plagued the exterior. As the steel barrier retreated into the wall, a breathtaking sight revealed itself. It was not a dark, dusty cellar. It was a brilliantly lit, state-of-the-art corridor. Sleek, industrial LED strip lights embedded in the ceiling flickered to life in a cascading sequence, illuminating a spotless, reinforced concrete staircase that descended deep underground. The light poured out into the dark, dilapidated barn, casting a surreal, futuristic glow across the rotting wood. I stood at the threshold, the rusted keys still clutched tightly in my hand. Whatever Diane had buried down there, it was meant to change everything. With my heart pounding relentlessly against my ribs, I stepped out of the cold, brutal night and began my descent into the brightly lit depths of my wife's hidden world. I gripped the smooth metal handrail, letting the heavy steel door slide silently shut behind me, sealing away the raging storm, the cold wind, and the rotting facade of the barn. As I walked slowly down the long, illuminated concrete steps, the air changed completely. The heavy stench of mildew and wet decay vanished, replaced by the crisp chill of a commercial-grade climate control system. I could hear the steady hum of powerful industrial air purifiers working in the background, maintaining a perfect atmospheric balance. My heavy work boots echoed against the walls, each step taking me further away from the nightmare above and deeper into a reality I could scarcely comprehend. I reached the bottom of the long staircase and stepped onto a vast expanse of polished, light gray epoxy flooring. The space was enormous, easily the size of an airplane hangar, with pristine white walls reflecting the brilliant LED lighting overhead. There was absolutely no hay scattered anywhere on the ground. There were no rusting tractors, no forgotten tools, and absolutely no trace of cow manure or dirt. The entire subterranean chamber was surgically clean, smelling faintly of high-grade leather, polished metal, and expensive car wax. I stood frozen at the base of the stairs, my eyes widening as they adjusted to the sheer magnitude of what was in front of me. Sitting immaculately under custom-angled spotlights were 4 of the most perfectly restored classic automobiles I had ever seen. This was the ultimate payoff. This was the treasure Diane had buried in the desert. To my left sat a pristine, deep metallic blue Shelby Cobra with twin white racing stripes running down its aggressive hood. The chrome side pipes gleamed under the lights, looking as though the car had just rolled off the factory floor in 1965. Right next to it, parked with absolute precision, were 2 stunning Aston Martins. They were classic models painted in a flawless silver birch finish, exuding an aura of timeless, sophisticated power. Their wire-spoke wheels and elegant curves caught the overhead lights, reflecting a level of craftsmanship that demanded absolute reverence. And finally, resting proudly on the right side of the vault, was a vintage cherry-red Ferrari. The paint job was so deep and flawless it looked like liquid glass. As an engineer, a man who had spent his life appreciating the mechanics of heavy machinery, I knew exactly what I was looking at. These were not just vehicles. They were masterworks of automotive history. They were incredibly rare investments that appreciated in value every single year. My mind quickly began to calculate the staggering wealth sitting quietly in this underground garage. The Shelby alone was a masterpiece, but combined with the 2 Aston Martins and that vintage Ferrari, the total value of this collection was easily worth $15 million. Maybe even more at a private auction. The sheer shock of it all took my breath away. Victoria and Derek had thrown me out into the rain, thinking they had left me destitute, holding the keys to a worthless pile of rotting wood. They had no idea that beneath their feet, guarded by a rusted padlock and a dead tree, lay an absolute fortune. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my trembling fingers lightly brushing the cold, polished fender of the Shelby Cobra. The polished metal was absolutely flawless. As I stared at my own reflection in the deep blue paint, a profound warmth began to spread through my chest, chasing away the bitter cold of the storm. I remembered my late wife, Diane. She was a brilliant woman who possessed an intellect that could dismantle any financial puzzle. As a senior forensic accountant, she spent decades tearing apart corporate ledgers, tracking phantom transactions, and exposing hidden wealth for high-profile clients. She knew the mechanics of deception better than anyone on earth. And looking around this magnificent sanctuary, I finally understood what she had been doing for the last 5 years of her life. The memories came flooding back, snapping into sharp focus. I remembered the late nights she spent locked in her home office, staring at heavily encrypted hard drives. I remembered the mysterious wire transfers she would casually wave off as portfolio restructuring, telling me she was moving our capital into safe municipal bonds to secure our retirement. She had not been buying bonds. She had been quietly, methodically liquidating our most vulnerable assets, converting massive amounts of cash into these untraceable high-yield automotive masterpieces and hiding them here far away from the prying eyes of the banking system. This vault was her ultimate masterpiece. It was a completely self-sustaining sanctuary designed to protect the wealth we had built together. Diane had seen the storm coming long before I ever noticed the dark clouds. She had looked at Derek with his expensive suits and arrogant smile, and her forensic intuition had instantly recognized a predator. She knew that he was a desperate man who would eventually drag our daughter down into his sinking ship of debt and fraud. She knew my unconditional love for Victoria would blind me to the danger, making me an easy target for their financial slaughter. So my brilliant wife built me a lifeboat. She constructed this underground fortress, secured it with our daughter's birthday as a painful reminder of why it was necessary, and left it waiting for the exact moment my world collapsed. I stood alone in the brilliant light of the vault, surrounded by millions of dollars in gleaming steel and chrome, and I wept. They were not tears of grief, but of profound gratitude. Diane had reached back from beyond the grave to save my life. I wiped the tears from my face, my sorrow hardening back into that cold, unbreakable fury. I was no longer just a penniless, broken old man. I was armed, I was funded, and I was completely ready to go to war. I tore my gaze away from the magnificent vehicles and began to inspect the rest of the underground sanctuary. Beyond the circle of overhead spotlights, tucked into a quiet corner of the massive concrete room, sat a heavy mahogany desk. It looked exactly like the one Diane used in her home office, complete with her favorite leather chair. I walked over to it, my footsteps echoing softly against the epoxy floor. Resting on top of the desk, bolted securely to the heavy wood, was a sleek black biometric safe. It was a formidable piece of security equipment, devoid of any visible keyholes or traditional dials. A small glass square waited for a fingerprint. I stared at it for a moment, a sudden wave of panic threatening to break my focus. Diane was gone. I did not have her fingerprints. But then I remembered the brilliant, meticulous nature of my wife. She never built a door without leaving me a key. I tentatively pressed my right thumb against the cool glass of the scanner. A thin blue laser swept across my skin. For a second, nothing happened. Then a soft chime broke the silence, and the heavy steel door of the safe sprang open. She had programmed my biometric data into the system long before she passed away, ensuring I would be the only person capable of accessing her final secrets. I reached inside the dark velvet-lined interior and pulled out 2 items. The first was a thick sealed envelope bearing the seal of an independent legal firm. It was her true, legally binding last will and testament, completely overriding the fraudulent document Victoria and Derek had presented earlier that morning. The second item was much heavier. It was a massive black leather binder, easily 3 inches thick, completely stuffed with financial records, bank statements, and printed emails. Printed in bold gold lettering across the front cover were the words Forensic Audit and Risk Assessment. I carried the heavy binder and the envelope over to the desk, turning on the small brass reading lamp. I sat down in Diane's leather chair, the familiar scent of her perfume lingering faintly in the air, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. I opened the binder. Resting on the very top of the massive stack of audit reports was a single piece of crisp white stationery. It was a handwritten letter from Diane addressed directly to me. My hands trembled as I recognized her elegant sweeping cursive. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves against the pain of hearing her voice in my mind one last time, and began to read the final words my wife ever wrote to me. My dearest George, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means my illness has finally taken me, and you have discovered the sanctuary I built for our protection. I am so deeply sorry for the pain you are going through right now, and I am even more sorry for the terrible truth I must reveal to you. I did not want to break your heart while I was still alive, but you need to know exactly what our daughter and her husband have done. I read the next few paragraphs, and with every sentence the blood froze in my veins. Diane explained that Derek's real estate hedge fund had not just failed due to market conditions. He had become utterly addicted to high-stakes illegal gambling, running up millions of dollars in catastrophic debts to a ruthless underground shadow syndicate. To keep these violent creditors from destroying his life, Derek had secretly forged my signature and used our beautiful $8 million Bel Air mansion as collateral to secure a massive unregulated loan. I stared at the paper in absolute disbelief. The home I had poured my life savings into, the roof I had painstakingly secured for my family, was currently owned by violent criminals. But the darkest, most horrifying truth was yet to come. The letter continued, George, my love. Victoria knew everything from the very beginning. She willingly helped Derek forge the property documents because she wanted to maintain her lavish, wealthy lifestyle at all costs. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been building a massive fraud and money laundering case against Derek for months. Their agents are preparing to raid the Bel Air mansion and seize the property within the next few days. Victoria and Derek knew the collapse was imminent, and they concocted a vile, unforgivable plan. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to take the absolute fall for the forged documents and the missing millions. They planned to throw you out of the house under the guise of an eviction, force you to sign a power of attorney, and then frame you as the mastermind behind the fraudulent loans. They want the authorities to believe that your supposed dementia caused you to make reckless financial decisions, leaving you to face the federal indictments and the fury of the shadow syndicate alone, while they escape with whatever funds they can steal from your retirement accounts. I dropped the letter onto the desk, my chest heaving, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked from the room. My own daughter did not just want to steal my money. She wanted to send me to a federal penitentiary to rot for the rest of my natural life, or worse, leave me at the deadly mercy of dangerous underground criminals. They had orchestrated a flawless slaughter of my entire existence. I looked back down at the massive binder of forensic evidence. Diane had spent her final days gathering every single shred of proof I would need to clear my name. The sorrow in my heart shattered instantly, replaced by an unstoppable avalanche of pure, cold wrath. I gathered the documents, my mind calculating the necessary counterattack. I was going to make sure they suffered for what they did to me. I was going to make them burn. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead and turned my attention back to the massive leather binder. My hands moved with a new mechanical precision. The initial shock had entirely faded, leaving behind a sharp, calculating focus. I flipped past the endless pages of forged loan documents, offshore wire transfers, and damning email transcripts. I needed to understand every single piece of ammunition my late wife had left for me. Near the very back of the binder, behind a thick plastic divider labeled Physical Assets, I noticed a stark shift in the type of documents. There were no more bank statements or legal contracts. Instead, the heavy pages were filled with complex geological surveys, environmental impact studies, and municipal zoning reports. I carefully pulled out a large, heavily creased piece of parchment, folded several times over. I pushed the reading lamp to the side and spread the document flat across the smooth mahogany desk. It was a detailed topographical map of the Mojave Desert region, specifically focusing on the desolate stretch of land surrounding this very property. My eyes traced the intricate contour lines and elevation markers. Someone had drawn heavy red circles around the exact coordinates of the rundown farm. But it was not the surface-level data that captured my attention. Below the topographical lines, shaded in a deep, vibrant blue, was an enormous subterranean structure. I leaned in closer, reading the technical legend printed in the bottom corner. It was an underground aquifer, a massive naturally occurring reservoir of pristine water hidden hundreds of feet beneath the dry, cracked desert floor. I quickly grabbed the attached environmental reports and began scanning the dense technical paragraphs. The pieces of the puzzle shifted again, forming a picture so clear and so devastating it almost made me laugh out loud in the empty, silent vault. Derek was currently under investigation by the federal government because his real estate hedge fund was hemorrhaging money. To save himself, he had been desperately pitching a revolutionary billion-dollar smart city development to a consortium of wealthy foreign investors. He promised them a futuristic oasis in the desert, complete with artificial lakes, lush golf courses, and thousands of luxury homes. But you cannot build an oasis in the middle of a barren wasteland without a massive, sustainable source of water. According to the geological surveys Diane had acquired, the city municipal water lines ended miles away from Derek's proposed construction site. Extending those lines would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and take a decade of political lobbying. The only viable immediate water source for his entire billion-dollar dream was the underground aquifer mapped out right in front of me. And this supposed garbage farm, the exact piece of land Victoria and Derek had mockingly discarded and left for me, sat directly on top of the primary access point for that entire reservoir. The reports detailed how Derek had secretly spent millions trying to find an alternative water source, drilling test wells on neighboring properties, but every single attempt had come up completely dry. The geography of the underground rock formations funneled every drop of that precious water directly beneath the rotting wooden barn, sitting above my head. Diane had discovered this secret. She had realized that the useless plot of land she purchased decades ago for pennies had suddenly become the most critical piece of real estate in the entire state. She knew Derek would eventually discover it too, and she knew he would do whatever it took to steal it. That was why she left the farm to me in her true will, while simultaneously letting Victoria believe it was worthless. The absolute brilliance of my late wife left me utterly speechless. I traced my finger along the blue-shaded area on the map, the reality of my situation washing over me in a wave of triumphant power. Whoever owned the deed to this isolated mildew-covered farm controlled the absolute future of Derek's entire corporate existence. He could forge all the property deeds in Los Angeles, he could borrow millions from the criminal underworld, and he could secure backing from the wealthiest investors on the planet. But without the water rights beneath my feet, his visionary smart city was nothing but a pile of dry sand. His company would collapse. His investors would demand their money back, and the federal authorities would lock him away for the rest of his miserable life. The land above me was not worthless. It was not a garbage farm. According to the conservative estimates in Diane's financial projections, the exclusive water rights alone were worth a staggering $40 million to the right commercial developer. I sat back in the leather chair, staring at the glowing blue paint of the Shelby Cobra sitting quietly in the vault. They thought they had buried me. They thought they had stripped me of my home, my money, and my dignity, leaving me to die in poverty, while they danced on my grave. Instead, they had unknowingly handed me the ultimate weapon. I possessed the very thing Derek desperately needed to save his life. He was going to come looking for it. He would soon realize the true value of the land he had mocked, and he would come crawling back to the desert to take it from me. But I would be waiting. I was completely ready to teach them a brutal lesson they would never forget, a lesson written in absolute ruin and total devastation. They wanted a war, and I was going to give them one. I carefully folded the topographical map and placed it back into the heavy leather binder. I locked the biometric safe, the soft chime echoing through the subterranean garage. I stood up feeling stronger and more alive than I had in years. The storm outside was finally breaking, but a much darker, much more destructive storm was just beginning. And this time I was the one holding the lightning. The pale light of dawn crept through the cracked window frames of the decaying barn, casting long gray shadows across the dusty wooden floor. I had spent the entire night down in the subterranean vault, memorizing every single detail of Diane's forensic files and carefully formulating my counterattack. My body was exhausted, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. As the sun began to rise over the barren Mojave Desert, I knew I could not stay underground. I needed to maintain the illusion of the helpless, discarded old man. I climbed the pristine concrete staircase, engaged the heavy drop-forged steel door, and watched as it glided silently shut, perfectly, sealing the brilliant vault away from the world. I locked the rusted padlock back onto the rotting wooden facade, just as a low, aggressive rumble echoed across the quiet desert landscape. I walked out onto the unsteady wooden porch, shielding my eyes from the morning glare. Tearing up the long, overgrown gravel driveway were two massive black sport utility vehicles. They moved with a reckless speed, kicking up a thick cloud of dry dust that settled heavily onto the chest-high weeds. The vehicles slammed to a halt just a few yards from the porch, their heavy doors swinging open in unison. Derek stepped out first. The smug, arrogant smirk he wore the night before in Bel Air was entirely gone, replaced by a tight, frantic expression of barely contained panic. He was no longer dressed in his relaxed evening wear, but wore a sharp, dark business suit that looked entirely out of place in the desert dirt. Right behind him emerged Victoria, my daughter, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously around the dilapidated property. They were not alone. From the second vehicle, two large, intimidating men stepped out into the morning heat. They wore cheap suits and possessed the cold, dead eyes of seasoned fixers, the kind of men shadow syndicates sent to quietly resolve expensive problems. The pieces of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. Derek's foreign investors, or his underground creditors, had finally demanded proof of the water rights for his billion-dollar smart city project. He had likely spent the early hours of the morning frantically tearing through the Bel Air mansion, searching for the original property deed to this farm, only to realize Diane had never kept it there. He had suddenly realized that the worthless piece of garbage land he had exiled me to was the only thing standing between him and a federal prison cell. He needed the original physical deed, and he needed it immediately to secure his fraudulent loans. They marched aggressively toward the porch, kicking aside the rotting wood and debris. Derek glared up at me, his chest heaving, as he tried to project an air of absolute authority. His jaw was clenched tight, and his fists were balled at his sides, betraying the immense, suffocating pressure he was currently facing from his lenders. Did you think I was going to scream at them? Did you think I would stand on the porch and confront my daughter for her unimaginable betrayal? Survivors know how to play the long game. If you are watching this right now and you want to see exactly how a 76-year-old man outsmarts a vicious pack of wolves, go down to the comments and type the words, "Fight back." Let me know that you stand with those who refuse to be broken by the people they trusted the most. Engage with this video because the lesson I am about to teach them is something everyone needs to witness. When you are standing completely unarmed against a desperate, cornered animal, the absolute worst thing you can do is show them your teeth. You do not roar at an enemy when you hold the ultimate advantage hidden beneath their feet. You play their game. You let them believe they are entirely in control right up until the exact moment you drop the floor out from under them. As Derek and his hired thugs stopped at the base of the wooden steps, I forced my shoulders to slump. I let my hands tremble visibly, dropping the rusted keys onto the muddy floorboards with a pathetic clatter. I widened my eyes, projecting the absolute picture of a terrified and broken old man who had spent a freezing night alone in the dark. Victoria stepped forward, pushing past her husband, her face twisted into a mask of cruel determination. She looked at my damp clothes and shivering frame without an ounce of empathy. "We need the original deed to this property right now," she demanded, her voice sharp and uncompromising in the quiet morning air. "Mom kept a lockbox with her important papers, and it is not at the house. Tell us where it is, old man." Her tone was so utterly devoid of love, so completely transactional, that it finally severed the last remaining emotional thread connecting me to her. She was no longer my little girl. She was an adversary. I looked at her, forcing a slight stutter into my voice as I pleaded ignorance. I told her I did not know what she was talking about, that my head was spinning, and that I just wanted to go home. Derek stepped up beside her, leaning dangerously close, his expensive cologne mixed with the foul stench of the rotting barn. "You do not have a home anymore, George," he hissed, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "You belong to us now. Give me the damn deed, or these two gentlemen are going to tear this garbage pile apart, piece by piece, with you inside it." He gestured to the two silent fixers who cracked their knuckles in practiced unison. They thought they had just backed a helpless victim into a corner. They had absolutely no idea they had just walked willingly into the jaws of a trap. Victoria took another step closer, closing the distance between us until she was standing right at the edge of the rotting wooden porch. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. It was not the deed. It was the document I had signed in the freezing rain the night before. The general power of attorney. She held it up, letting the morning breeze catch the edge of the heavy legal paper. "You really do not understand the situation you are in, Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, clinical tone that sounded completely foreign to me. "You actually think you can just hide out here and play the stubborn old man. But you do not have that luxury anymore. We do not actually need you to willingly hand over the property deed. It would just make things much faster." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the signature line where I had blindly written my name. "Because of this little document, I have complete legal authority over your medical and financial decisions. If you do not walk into that decaying barn right now and bring me the original lockbox with the property deed, Derek and I are going straight to a judge. We already have the paperwork drawn up. We are going to file for a forced medical conservatorship. You will be declared legally incompetent, and as your official guardian, I will just sign the property deed directly over to Derek's company myself. So you have a simple choice. You give us the deed right now, and maybe we let you stay in a cheap assisted living facility. Or you refuse and you spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a padded cell, heavily medicated and completely forgotten. The choice is yours, but we are leaving here with that land today." Derek slowly crossed his arms, a highly sickening grin returning quickly to his arrogant face. He nodded toward the two massive fixers standing silently by the vehicles. "If we really have to do this the hard way tonight, George, my associates here are fully trained in patient extraction. They will physically drag you out of here violently, throw you in the back of that black SUV, and deliver you straight to the psychiatric intake facility. The doctors are already expecting a combative senior citizen. Any resistance you show will just prove to them exactly how unhinged you have become. You are now entirely and hopelessly trapped. I stood silently there on the creaking wooden porch, the desert wind suddenly feeling colder than the storm from the night before. I had spent the entire night preparing myself for a financial battle. I had armed myself with Diane's forensic audit ready to destroy their fraudulent empire. But I was not prepared for this level of absolute sociopathic cruelty. The sheer malice radiating from my own daughter completely paralyzed me. This was the child I had held in the delivery room, weeping with joy. This was the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, the bright teenager, whose expensive college tuition I had worked endless overtime to pay the bride I had proudly walked down the aisle. And now, here she was standing firmly in the dry dirt, coldly threatening to drug me and lock me in a psychiatric prison just to steal a single piece of desert land. The absolute betrayal completely transcended just money. It transcended property rights and billion-dollar smart cities. This was a profound, unnatural violation of the human soul. For a brief, terrifying moment, the carefully constructed mask of the helpless old man I was wearing almost cracked, not out of fear, but out of a crushing, suffocating sorrow. My own breathing instantly became extremely shallow. My chest then tightened so severely I thought my heart might actually stop beating. I looked deeply into Victoria's eyes, desperately searching for even a tiny flicker of hesitation, a single shred of guilt or remorse. There was absolutely nothing. Her gaze was as empty and unforgiving as a black hole. She had completely detached herself from my humanity. To her, I was now no longer a living human being with a beating heart, or was I the father who had sacrificed everything? I was just an obstacle standing in the way of her luxury, a problem that needed to be chemically sedated and locked away behind thick steel doors. The psychological conflict reached its absolute peak, vibrating through my aging bones with a devastating intensity. I realized then that if I made a single misstep, if I showed them the furious, calculating engineer standing beneath the surface, they would instantly trigger their trap. They would unleash the fixers, drag me away, and bury me in a medical nightmare where my voice would never be heard again. My very life was literally hanging by a thread, held in the manicured hands of a monster I had once created and loved so unconditionally. I slowly let my knees drop. It was not entirely an act at first, as their cruelty had physically drained me, but I forced my body to collapse entirely. I hit the rotting wooden floorboards of the porch with a heavy, painful thud. I began to hyperventilate, taking short, ragged gasps of air, clutching my chest, as if my heart were actively failing. "Please," I wheezed, letting a steady stream of tears spill over my wrinkled cheeks. "Please, Victoria, do not let them take me to that dark ward. I am so terribly confused. My mind is incredibly foggy since your beautiful mother passed away." I pressed my forehead against the damp wood, sobbing loudly, painting the exact picture of the broken old man they wanted. I began to ramble uncontrollably, stringing together disjointed sentences about Diane, about the freezing rain, about things that made no sense to anyone. "I need to find the metal box," I cried out, my voice cracking with a pathetic, high-pitched desperation. Diane hid the metal box. She put the papers inside it for safekeeping, but I just cannot remember where she buried it. Everything is just so dark, and my precious memory is slipping away from me faster every single hour. Give me some time. Just give me time to remember." Derek scoffed loudly, stepping back rapidly, as if my tears might infect his tailored suit. "Oh, for heaven's sake, look at him right now, Victoria," he muttered, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "He is completely losing his mind. He probably buried the damn thing somewhere out in the weeds like a dog." Victoria looked down at me, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated irritation. "Stop crying right now, Dad," she snapped, treating me exactly like a disobedient toddler. "It is completely pathetic to watch. Where did Mom put the lockbox?" I shook my head frantically, wrapping my trembling arms around my knees and rocking back and forth on the creaking porch. I do not know. I whimpered, staring blankly at the muddy gravel below my heavy boots. I just need a little quiet time to clear my head. 2 days. Just give me 48 hours. If I can just walk the property and look at the trees, I know I will definitely remember where she put it. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees, do not send me to the hospital. I promise I will find your papers. Derek sighed heavily, rubbing his temples in extreme visible frustration. We do not have 48 hours to waste on this useless lunatic, he hissed at his wife. We need that physical deed before the bank examiners return to our corporate office on Monday morning. Victoria held up a manicured hand, silencing him instantly. She stared down at my trembling, pathetic form, coldly calculating the logistical odds. If we try to forcibly commit him today, the bureaucratic paperwork at the state hospital could easily delay us by a week, she whispered sharply to Derek, though I could hear every single word clearly. The psychiatric evaluation process takes valuable time, and we absolutely do not have time. If he thinks he can find it out here in the dirt, let him dig. We will come back in exactly 2 days. Derek scowled, clearly unhappy with the delay, but he knew she was right about the legal system. He glared down at me, his eyes narrowing with a vicious, unspoken threat. You have exactly 48 hours, old man, he sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my face. If you do not have that original property deed in your hands. When we return on Sunday morning, I will personally drag you by your thinning hair and throw you into a padded cell myself. Do you understand me? I nodded weakly, continuing to sob and rock back and forth, refusing to make eye contact. Disgusted by my pathetic display, Victoria turned on her expensive heels and marched swiftly back toward the idling black vehicles. Derek followed closely behind her, signaling for the 2 massive fixers to stand down and return to the second car. The heavy car doors slammed shut in rapid succession, a sound that echoed sharply across the quiet, barren desert landscape. The engines roared to life, kicking up another massive cloud of dry dust and gravel as they violently reversed out of the long driveway. I remained on my knees, keeping my head bowed until the sound of their tires completely faded into the distance. The second their red taillights vanished beyond the horizon, my entire physical demeanor shifted. The trembling stopped instantly. The pathetic, ragged breathing smoothed out into slow, measured, completely controlled breaths. My tears dried up like rain on a hot desert highway. I placed my hands flat against the wooden floorboards and pushed myself up to a full, commanding standing position. I rolled my shoulders back, the illusion of the helpless, senile victim evaporating into the morning air. My eyes, previously wide with fake terror, turned absolutely ice-cold. They had taken the bait perfectly. They thought they had given me a deadline to surrender, but they had actually given me the exact amount of time I needed to completely destroy them. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my damp coat and pulled out a small prepaid burner phone I had secretly purchased weeks ago, anticipating that Derek might try to monitor or cut off my primary communications. I punched in a number I had memorized long ago. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered the line. Jonathan, I said, my voice steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. It is George. Yes, it happened exactly as Diane predicted. Derek is drowning and they just tried to force me into a medical conservatorship. They gave me 48 hours. I need you to gather everything we discussed yesterday. It is time to execute her final master plan. The sun dipped below the rugged desert horizon, plunging the barren landscape back into a deep, familiar darkness. The wind howled against the rotting wooden frame of the barn above. But down here, surrounded by millions of dollars in pristine automotive history, I was perfectly safe from the elements. I waited in the absolute silence of the underground vault, surrounded by the pristine classic cars that Diane had so carefully procured. Just before midnight, the heavy steel door hissed open, and the sleek, polished shoes of Jonathan Reed clicked against the concrete stairs. He was a brilliant attorney, a man who possessed a quiet, lethal intelligence perfectly matched to my late wife. But Jonathan was not alone. Walking silently behind him was an older, sharply dressed gentleman carrying two massive reinforced steel briefcases. This was the discreet private collector Jonathan had promised to contact. He was a man of immense wealth who operated entirely outside the traditional banking system, specializing in acquiring rare automotive masterpieces without leaving a single paper trail for the authorities to follow. I guided them toward the center of the brightly lit room, my footsteps echoing loudly against the smooth epoxy floor. The collector stopped dead in his tracks the moment his eyes landed on the pristine, deep metallic blue Shelby Cobra. He walked around the vehicle with a quiet, almost religious reverence, tracing his gloved fingers over the flawless chrome side pipes and the twin white racing stripes. He did not need to check the engine block or ask for a detailed service history. A man of his caliber knew exactly what he was looking at, recognizing the sheer perfection of the restoration work. He turned to me, offering a single respectful nod. He placed the heavy briefcases onto Diane's mahogany desk and popped the metallic latches. Inside, stacked with absolute precision, were bundles of crisp, unmarked $100 bills. $2 million in cold, untraceable cash. It was a staggering amount of physical currency, carrying a distinct, sharp smell of fresh ink and paper that filled the enclosed space. Selling the Shelby felt like letting go of a piece of my wife's magnificent legacy, a brief pang of sorrow echoing in my chest. But as I looked at the towering stacks of money, I knew this was exactly what she had intended. This vault was not a museum meant to gather dust. It was a fully stocked armory prepared for a financial war. I reached out and shook the collector's hand to finalize the agreement. He respectfully backed the Shelby out of the vault, the engine roaring with a beautiful ferocity, and drove it off into the desert night, leaving Jonathan and me alone with the resources I desperately needed. I was no longer a penniless old man entirely at the mercy of my daughter's cruel ambitions. I now possessed a formidable war chest, and it was time to actively prepare for the upcoming slaughter. Jonathan wasted absolutely no time. By dawn, he had facilitated the next crucial phase of our counterattack. He used a portion of the untraceable cash to secure the services of an elite private security firm based out of Los Angeles. These were not the cheap, low-level thugs Derek had hired to intimidate me. These were highly trained former military operatives who specialized in corporate protection and high-threat extraction. I met with the lead security contractor, a broad-shouldered veteran with cold, calculating eyes, and handed him a thick envelope of cash. I gave him a detailed dossier on Derek Victoria and the two fixers they had brought to the farm. I instructed him to establish a total surveillance net around the Bel Air mansion and the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where Derek was desperately trying to finalize his fraudulent smart city development deal. I needed to know every single move they made, every phone call they placed, and every breath they took over the next 48 hours. The security team deployed immediately, utilizing encrypted communication channels and state-of-the-art tracking devices, moving with a silent, deadly efficiency that instantly leveled the playing field. For the first time since my beautiful wife passed away, I felt a genuine sense of absolute unwavering control over my own destiny. But I knew that raw power and legal maneuvering were not quite enough. I needed to send a profound psychological message when I finally stepped back into their world. I could not walk into their glamorous hotel ballroom wearing the damp, wrinkled clothes of a discarded victim. Jonathan arranged for a master tailor to be flown out to our secure location that very afternoon. The tailor brought racks of the finest fabrics in the world, carrying measuring tapes and chalk, taking my precise measurements with practiced speed and unquestioning professionalism. I commissioned a bespoke Italian tailored suit, choosing a dark charcoal gray wool that exuded cold, uncompromising authority. When I finally put the finished garments on and stood in front of the full-length mirror, the transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The frail, grieving, shivering old man, who had begged on his knees in the dirt, was completely gone. Staring back at me was a formidable titan of industry, an architect of destruction with ice in his veins. The sharp cut of the suit broadened my shoulders, and the weight of the expensive fabric served as armor for the battle ahead. I slowly adjusted my silk tie and buttoned the jacket, feeling the heavy cold resolve settle permanently into my bones. Victoria and Derek had completely underestimated the foundation I was built upon. They thought they had buried a helpless sheep, but they had merely awakened a sleeping lion. I was no longer the victim of their vicious greed. I was the executioner, and I was coming to collect their absolute ruin with a vengeance they could never possibly anticipate. The desert highway stretched endlessly into the dark as Jonathan drove us away from the hidden underground vault. We traveled for over an hour before pulling into the gravel parking lot of an isolated 24-hour diner sitting right on the edge of the county line. The flickering red neon sign buzzed loudly in the cold night air, casting a harsh light over the empty stretch of road. Inside the diner was completely deserted, except for a tired waitress wiping down the front counter and two men sitting quietly in a dimly lit corner booth. They were dressed in unremarkable dark suits, nursing black coffee, their posture rigid and intensely observant. These were the senior federal agents Jonathan had contacted. As we approached the table, they stood up, their eyes quickly scanning my new, sharply tailored charcoal suit. They had probably expected a confused, disheveled old man based on the initial phone call, but the person standing before them commanded absolute respect. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth opposite them, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Jonathan sat beside me, placing his briefcase on the floor. Without wasting a single second on pleasantries, I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out the massive black binder. The binder containing Diane's final, magnificent masterpiece. I placed it squarely in the center of the scratched table and slowly pushed it across to the lead agent. He looked down at the gold lettering, then back up at me, his expression neutral but intensely curious. I told them that inside that binder, they would find the absolute destruction of Vanguard properties. I explained that my late wife was a senior forensic accountant and that she had spent her final years meticulously tracking every single illicit transaction Derek Lawson had ever made. I detailed the offshore wire transfers, the unregulated shadow syndicate loans, the massive gambling debts, and the forged property deeds used to secure illegal collateral. The lead agent opened the heavy cover and began to flip through the first few pages. His partner leaned in close, his eyes scanning the incredibly detailed financial spreadsheets, the intercepted email transcripts, and the copies of the forged signatures. For several long, agonizing minutes, the only sound in the quiet diner was the steady hum of the ancient refrigerator unit and the crisp turning of heavy paper. The agents did not say a word, but I could see the subtle changes in their expressions. The initial skepticism melting away, replaced by a deep, professional astonishment. Diane had not just given them a tip, she had handed them a fully investigated trial-ready federal case wrapped in a neat bow. Every single missing dollar was perfectly tracked. Every single fraudulent shell company was exposed and completely documented. The lead agent finally closed the heavy binder, resting his large hands flat against the leather cover. He let out a long, slow breath, looking directly into my eyes, with a newfound sense of profound gravity. He quietly admitted that they had been trying to build a solid case against Derek for the past 8 months, but the corporate veils were incredibly thick, and they lacked the definitive smoking gun required to secure a federal indictment. Now, thanks to my extraordinary wife, they held the silver bullet. They had more than enough irrefutable evidence to arrest Derek for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. I leaned forward across the table, my voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. I told them that I did not just want Derek arrested quietly in the middle of the night. I wanted it to happen in the most public, devastating way imaginable. I informed the agents about the massive billion-dollar smart city signing ceremony Derek had scheduled for the very next afternoon at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Derek had invited all of his wealthy foreign investors, the local press, and the city politicians to witness his supposed triumph. He believed he was completely untouchable. I proposed a perfectly coordinated trap. I wanted to walk into that luxurious ballroom, look my betrayers directly in the eye, and completely shatter their world just seconds before the federal authorities swarmed the building. The two senior agents exchanged a long, calculated look. Normally, the Bureau prefers quiet, controlled takedowns to avoid public spectacles. But the sheer magnitude of the evidence Diane had provided gave me unprecedented leverage in this negotiation. Furthermore, arresting Derek in a room full of the very investors he was actively attempting to defraud would instantly solidify the federal case and prevent any potential international funds from being illegally transferred. The lead agent gave a slow, firm nod. We spent the next 2 hours drinking bitter diner coffee and meticulously planning every single second of the upcoming operation. We mapped out the hotel blueprints, coordinating the exact entry points for the tactical arrest teams. We established a secure communication signal. Jonathan would be by my side, ensuring that every legal angle was completely covered, while the private security team I had hired earlier would seamlessly integrate with the federal agents to lock down the perimeter of the ballroom. I would be the first one to breach the doors. I would draw all of their attention, expose the geographical reality of the water rights, and corner them completely. The moment Derek realized his entire empire was built on sand, the moment the absolute terror set in, the authorities would move in to deliver the final crushing blow. As we finalized the tactical strategy and shook hands, a deep, resonant calm settled over my entire body. The anger and the profound sorrow that had nearly broken me in the desert had completely vanished. It was replaced by a cold, mathematical certainty. Victoria and Derek had stripped me of my home, my savings, and my dignity. They had planned to lock me away in a dark, padded cell and erase my existence, but they had tragically forgotten who built the foundation they were standing on. Tomorrow afternoon, under the bright, expensive chandeliers of the hotel, I was going to tear their entire world down to the absolute ground. The following afternoon, the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Los Angeles was a masterclass in manufactured opulence. Crystal chandeliers, the size of small vehicles, hung from the intricately painted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering of the city elite. A live string quartet played softly in the corner, their classical melodies floating above the low murmur of wealthy conversations. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided effortlessly across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate porcelain spoons filled with imported caviar. At the very center of this lavish display stood Derek and my daughter Victoria. They were holding court, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy foreign investors and local politicians. Derek was wearing a tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people earn in a year. He held a glass of champagne in one hand and gestured expansively with the other, his face flushed with the absolute arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. Victoria stood faithfully by his side, draped in a stunning emerald green designer gown, a diamond necklace resting perfectly against her collarbone. She laughed lightly at something one of the investors said, her smile looking so genuine, so perfectly practiced, that it made my stomach turn. They were completely in their element, soaking in the admiration and the envy of the room, entirely convinced that they had successfully crushed the senile old man. From their perspective, the victory was already absolute and unquestionable. They firmly believed that I was still out in the freezing Mojave Desert, crawling around in the overgrown weeds on my hands and knees, desperately searching for a metal lockbox that did not even exist. They thought my spirit was completely broken, my mind rapidly deteriorating into a pathetic state of absolute confusion and terror. They were celebrating not just a business deal, but the successful theft of my entire life savings and the impending erasure of my legal existence. Derek raised his glass high, tapping the edge with a silver spoon to draw the attention of his wealthy audience. He spoke with a smooth, magnetic charisma, painting a vivid, breathtaking picture of his visionary smart city. He described lush, sprawling golf courses, massive artificial lakes, and endless rows of futuristic luxury homes rising from the barren desert sand. He pointed toward a massive, illuminated architectural model situated in the center of the ballroom, detailing the incredible return on investment his partners were about to experience. The investors nodded in greedy agreement, captivated by the beautiful illusion he was spinning. They had absolutely no idea that the brilliant visionary standing before them was drowning in catastrophic debt to a violent underground syndicate. They had no idea that the magnificent $8 million Bel Air mansion Derek used to project his wealth was currently facing foreclosure due to forged signatures. The atmosphere in the ballroom was dripping with a heavy, intoxicating extravagance, but beneath the surface it was nothing more than a fragile house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. Every single detail of the event was a carefully constructed lie. The massive ice sculptures shaped like modern skyscrapers slowly melting near the buffet tables were paid for with stolen money. The expensive silk drapery framing the tall windows was funded by fraudulent offshore accounts. Even the bright, enthusiastic smiles of the corporate executives were completely hollow, masking the deep, bleeding financial wounds Vanguard Properties was desperately trying to conceal. The sheer audacity of the gathering was almost difficult to comprehend. Derek was standing in the middle of a room filled with powerful, dangerous men, asking them to hand over billions of dollars for a city that had no water, no foundation, and absolutely no future. The tension was incredibly thick, vibrating through the heavy bass of the string quartet and the clinking of expensive crystal. It was a lavish, beautiful tomb decorated perfectly. For a funeral nobody in the room knew they were attending. The investors were completely blind to the federal agents quietly moving into position in the hotel lobby downstairs. They were blind to the private security operatives securing the freight elevators and monitoring the fire exits. And most importantly, they were entirely blind to the storm that was gathering just outside the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. As the highly anticipated signing ceremony drew closer, Victoria guided the lead foreign investor toward a long oak table. She smiled brightly, completely detached from the horrific betrayal she had committed. They genuinely thought the story was over. They thought they had won. But their spectacular downfall was finally about to begin. The beautifully arranged flowers on the table masked the rot underneath. Victoria picked up a solid gold fountain pen, turning it over in her manicured hands, ready to sign away billions based on pure fiction. She looked across the crowded room at her husband, sharing a deeply conspiratorial glance. They believed that the crushing weight of their massive debts was finally lifting, replaced by a glorious golden future built entirely upon my absolute destruction. The musicians seamlessly transitioned into a sweeping, triumphant crescendo, perfectly matching the immense ego radiating from Derek as he took his place at the head of the table. He cleared his throat, preparing to deliver his final victorious speech to the gathered elite. Every camera flash captured the flawless illusion of their success. Every handshake sealed another layer of their profound deception. They were standing exactly where they had always wanted to be elevated, high above the consequences of their cruel actions, entirely untouchable in their luxurious fortress. But luxury cannot stop justice. And a fortress made of lies offers absolutely no protection when the foundation is ripped away. They thought they had written the end of my story. Instead, they had merely set the stage for my glorious, unforgettable return. The trap was now absolutely perfectly primed. The string quartet reached a soaring, beautiful climax, just as Derek leaned over the polished oak table, his hand hovering gracefully over the binding investment contracts. He wore the triumphant, sickening smile of a man who believed he had successfully stolen the world. But his moment of absolute glory was about to be violently shattered. Without warning, the massive, intricately carved mahogany doors of the grand ballroom did not just open. They were forcefully thrown apart. The heavy brass handles slammed against the marble walls with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot, through the cavernous space. The sudden explosive noise caused the elegant string quartet to completely halt their performance, the cellist dragging his bow across the strings in a harsh, discordant screech. The low murmur of wealthy conversation instantly died, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Every single head in the room, from the foreign billionaires to the local politicians, turned simultaneously toward the main entrance. Stepping through the grand threshold were four large men in immaculate dark suits, the elite private security team I had hired. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, fanning out to secure the immediate perimeter of the doorway, their hands resting calmly but purposefully near their waistbands. And then I walked in. I was no longer the broken, shivering, soaking wet old man they had thrown out into the freezing rain just a few nights ago. I was no longer the pathetic, sobbing victim, kneeling in the desert dirt, begging my cruel daughter for mercy. I stepped into the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers as a formidable titan of industry. The bespoke charcoal gray Italian wool suit draped perfectly over my broad shoulders, serving as an impenetrable suit of armor. Every step I took against the polished marble floor resonated with absolute, uncompromising authority. I held my head high, my posture perfectly straight, channeling 40 years of commanding heavy construction sites into a single devastating presence. Flanking my right side was Jonathan Reed, holding his heavy leather briefcase, his face set in a cold, calculating expression of legal execution. The wealthy investors closest to the door instinctively took a step back, parting like the sea to create a wide, clear path directly down the center of the ballroom. They did not know who I was, but the sheer gravity radiating from our entrance commanded their absolute silence and respect. I did not look at the expensive ice sculptures or the terrified waiters holding trays of spilled champagne. My eyes were locked entirely on the head table at the far end of the room. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The elaborate, multi-million-dollar illusion that Vanguard Properties had spent months building was already beginning to crumble just from the weight of my arrival. I was the architect of their destruction, and I had finally come to collect my absolute due from the very people who tried to bury me alive. As I strode purposefully down the long center aisle of the ballroom, I kept my gaze fixed with laser precision on my daughter and her husband. The physical transformation in their demeanor was absolutely spectacular to witness. The smug, arrogant confidence that had defined Derek for years instantly evaporated into the heavily air-conditioned atmosphere. The blood completely drained from his handsome face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade of ash. His hand, still hovering above the lucrative investment contracts, began to tremble so violently that he dropped the solid gold fountain pen. It clattered loudly against the oak table, rolling off the edge and bouncing onto the marble floor. Beside him, Victoria looked as though she had just seen a ghost rise directly from the grave. Her jaw was unhinged, her eyes wide with profound shock and uncontrollable panic. This was the exact moment their meticulously crafted reality broke. They had been certain I was rotting in the Mojave Desert, entirely powerless, and waiting to be locked in a psychiatric ward. Seeing me here flanked by elite security and radiating wealth completely short-circuited their deceitful minds. They were paralyzed by the terrifying realization that they had fundamentally miscalculated their enemy. I did not stop walking until I reached the very front of the room, standing just feet away from the head table. Derek opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to order security to remove me, but no sound came out of his dry throat. I stepped past him, ignoring his trembling form, and walked directly up to the presentation podium. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and took the microphone from its silver stand. The sudden movement caused a sharp whine of audio feedback to pierce through the quiet ballroom, making several guests wince and cover their ears. I adjusted my silk tie, placed my hands firmly on the wooden podium, and looked out over the sea of confused faces. The silence in the room was so absolute you could hear the humming of the massive crystal chandeliers above us. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the certainty of justice settling into my chest. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice booming through the high-quality sound system rich with steady, unwavering authority. I apologize for the interruption of this beautiful celebration. My name is George Caldwell. I am the father-in-law of your visionary host, Derek Lawson. I know many of you are preparing to transfer billions into his proposed smart city development today. But before you sign those contracts, there is a fundamental geographical reality about this project that my son-in-law has deliberately chosen to hide from you. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my words sink into the minds of investors. I glanced sideways at Derek, who was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the exits. His empire was built on a foundation of lies, and I was about to pull the final pin. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit and retrieved my secure device. Jonathan stepped forward seamlessly, plugging a small auxiliary cable from the podium's sophisticated soundboard directly into my phone. I looked down at Victoria, whose face had now shifted from profound shock to sheer, pure, unadulterated terror. She took a panicked step toward me, her manicured hand raised in a desperate, silent plea, but my elite security team instantly moved to block her path, standing like an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. I tapped the screen. The crisp, digitized audio filled the cavernous ballroom, echoing off the massive crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors. It was the exact recording I had captured during their vicious morning ambush at the farm. Victoria's cold, clinical voice rang out with terrifying clarity for every single person to hear. If you do not walk into that decaying barn right now and bring me the original lockbox with the property deed, Derek and I are going straight to a judge. We will file for a forced medical conservatorship. I will have you locked inside a high-security state-run psychiatric ward. They will drug you, strap you to a bed, and leave you to rot in a white room where nobody will ever listen to a single word you say. A collective audible gasp ripped through the dense crowd of wealthy investors and local politicians. The delicate, joyful sound of clinking champagne glasses completely ceased. The horrifying, undeniable reality of her words hung heavily in the air. The elite society members, the very people who had just been laughing and drinking expensive wine with her, now stared at Victoria with absolute revulsion. She physically shrank under the immense weight of their collective disgust, covering her trembling mouth with both of her hands as tears of pure humiliation finally spilled down her pale cheeks. The digital recording continued without mercy, playing Derek's highly aggressive threat to have his violent associates physically drag me away by my thinning hair. The wealthy investors began to murmur furiously among themselves. They were ruthless, calculated businessmen, but this level of profound sociopathic cruelty, directed at a grieving father, was entirely beyond the pale. I paused the recording and looked directly at the lead foreign investor, the powerful man who had been holding the solid gold pen just moments before. I asked him, my voice echoing loudly across the silent room, if this was the kind of moral foundation he wished to build his billion-dollar legacy upon. I asked him if he truly trusted a desperate man who would gladly chemically sedate his own grieving father-in-law just to steal a barren patch of desert dirt. The older investor stared at Derek with unmasked contempt. He slowly placed the gold pen down on the polished oak table and took a definitive, highly visible step away from the podium. The entire room was shifting, the carefully constructed illusion crumbling piece by beautiful piece. But the emotional betrayal was only the very beginning of their absolute ruin. I signaled to Jonathan, who unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved the massive, thick geological survey map Diane had meticulously hidden inside her underground vault. With a swift, highly practiced motion, Jonathan unfurled the heavy parchment across the wooden podium, letting it drape over the edges for the entire front row of wealthy investors to see clearly. I leaned into the microphone once more, my voice cutting sharply through the rising tide of angry, confused whispers. I instructed the investors to look closely at the complex topographical lines and the deep blue shaded areas indicating the massive subterranean aquifer. I explained that Derek Lawson had promised them a futuristic revolutionary oasis, a sprawling smart city with artificial lakes, lush golf courses, and endless water reserves. What he conveniently failed to mention to his financial backers was that his fraudulent company did not actually own a single drop of that precious water. I pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the thick red circle on the map marking the exact location of my supposedly dilapidated farm. I declared loudly that the only viable massive water source for the entire desert region sat directly beneath the property my late wife had legally left solely to me. Derek had secretly spent millions of dollars drilling dry holes, desperately trying to secure an alternative source before this very signing ceremony. But he had completely and utterly failed. He was standing here today, standing in front of the world, asking for billions of dollars in foreign capital to build a massive luxury city that would never ever have running water. The shocked murmurs in the crowd instantly erupted into outright furious shouting. Several powerful investors slammed their hands furiously on the oak table, demanding immediate, truthful answers from Derek. He tried to speak, his voice cracking pitifully as he stammered out weak, pathetic excuses about pending municipal negotiations and imaginary alternative pipelines. But I cut him off, my voice booming over the sophisticated sound system with devastating, absolute finality. I announced to the chaotic room that there would be absolutely no negotiations. I looked Derek dead in the terrified eyes, watching the very last remaining shred of his arrogant, deceitful ego shatter into a million irreparable pieces on the marble floor. I publicly declared that the invaluable water rights beneath the Mojave Desert would never, under any circumstances, belong to Vanguard Properties or any of his desperate, fraudulent shell companies. I held up the true, legally binding and certified will that Diane had left inside the biometric safe. I told the furious crowd that the land belonged to me, and I would rather let the burning desert swallow it whole than let a single drop of that water flow into a fake city built on deceit, elder abuse, and catastrophic financial fraud. The lead investor picked up his heavy leather portfolio, signaled aggressively to his legal team, and began marching toward the ballroom exit. As the lead investor pushed his way through the stunned crowd, the absolute finality of the ruined deal finally pierced through Victoria's shock. She completely snapped. Her carefully manicured facade crumbled into an ugly mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. She lunged forward, nearly tripping over the hem of her expensive emerald gown, and snatched a microphone from a secondary stand on the table. Her voice, stripped of all its fake honeyed charm, echoed harshly through the ballroom. "Stop him!" she screamed, pointing at the exiting billionaire. "Please do not listen to a single word this man is saying. He is completely out of his mind." She dug into her clutch and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper she had forced me to sign in the rain just nights ago. She waved it wildly in the air like a desperate flag of surrender. "This is a legally binding power of attorney," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense strain. "My father is severely ill. He is suffering from advanced dementia caused by the sudden death of my mother. He does not know what he is talking about. He does not own anything, and he has absolutely no legal capacity to make any statements regarding Vanguard Properties or the water rights." She turned her frantic eyes toward the bewildered hotel security staff gathered near the edges of the room. "Remove him immediately," she commanded, stamping her heel against the marble floor. "I am his legal guardian, and I am ordering you to escort this man out of the building. He is a physical danger to himself and to everyone in this room. Call the authorities and have him committed right now." Derek, completely paralyzed by his own impending doom, could only watch as his wife descended into a public, humiliating frenzy. The wealthy guests simply stood there, in a state of morbid fascination, watching an elite socialite completely lose her grip on reality. I did not move a single muscle. I stood at the podium, staring down at my daughter with profound pity and absolute disgust. She genuinely believed that her cruel, forced signature was still her ultimate trump card. But she had entirely forgotten that the brilliant woman who raised her was always 10 steps ahead. The private security operatives I had hired immediately stepped forward, forming a highly disciplined physical barrier. The hotel guards wisely decided to stay completely out of the conflict. Victoria realized her commands were falling on deaf ears. She frantically searched the faces of the remaining crowd for any sign of support, but she found absolutely nothing except harsh, condemning judgment. She was entirely alone, standing on a stage that was rapidly catching fire. Before Victoria could unleash another desperate scream, Jonathan Reed moved. He stepped out from my right side, calmly adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and walked directly up to the edge of the polished oak table. He did not need a microphone to command the room. His deep voice possessed the cold, surgical precision of a seasoned litigator preparing to deliver a fatal blow. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his tone utterly devoid of any human sympathy, "I strongly suggest you lower your voice and put that piece of paper away before you embarrass yourself any further." Victoria glared at him, clutching the power of attorney tightly against her chest. "Who are you?" she spat viciously. "I am Jonathan Reed, senior partner at Reed & Associates and the personal legal executor of your late mother's entire estate," he replied smoothly. "And it is my professional duty to inform you that the document you are currently waiving is completely worthless." Victoria froze instantly, her eyes darting frantically between Jonathan's stoic face and the crumpled paper in her trembling hand. "That is a lie," she stammered, her arrogant confidence severely wavering. He signed it willingly. "I have total, absolute legal control over all of his financial assets." Jonathan offered a small, terrifyingly polite smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "You have control over the assets held directly in his personal name," he corrected her with flawless legal clarity. "But your brilliant mother, anticipating exactly this kind of predatory behavior, took careful legal precautions many months before she passed away. The farm in the Mojave Desert, the subterranean aquifer beneath it, and the millions of dollars in classic automotive assets hidden on the property do not actually belong to your father." Victoria blinked, a sudden glimmer of hope flashing in her tear-filled eyes. "Then they belong to the estate," she said quickly, "and as her only biological daughter, I have an immediate legal claim to that property." Jonathan slowly shook his head, looking down at her as if she were a remarkably dull student. He then delivered the absolute, undeniable kill shot. "No, Mrs. Caldwell," he stated firmly. "The farm and all of its invaluable associated assets were quietly transferred into a blind, irrevocable trust. And by the very definition of trust law in this state, an irrevocable trust cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit permission of the original grantor. Since your mother is deceased, that highly secure legal structure is permanently locked in stone forever. Your father is the sole named beneficiary, allowing him full access to the resources, but he does not hold the direct title. Therefore, your fraudulently obtained power of attorney has absolutely zero legal jurisdiction over the land, the water, or the hidden wealth. It cannot touch a single cent of what Diane built. That document you are holding is nothing more than a useless piece of scrap paper. You own nothing. You control nothing. And you have absolutely no power here today." The deafening silence that followed his calm declaration was spiritually crushing. The final desperate lifeline Victoria had clung to was brutally severed. The piece of paper slowly slipped from her weak fingers, fluttering uselessly through the quiet air until it landed on the cold marble floor. Her knees finally buckled the unimaginable weight of her total defeat, bringing her heavily down to the ground. She had sacrificed her father and her entire soul for a kingdom made of ash and deceit. And right now, the cold wind of justice was blowing it all entirely away. As the useless piece of paper settled onto the cold marble floor, the final phase of our meticulously planned operation commenced. The remaining wealthy investors scrambled toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the collapse of Vanguard Properties. But before the heavy doors could close, a booming voice echoed over the chaos. "Federal agents, nobody move." From every entrance of the luxurious ballroom, men and women in dark tactical jackets poured into the space. The two senior FBI agents I met, led the charge, their badges gleaming brightly. My private security team stepped aside, allowing authorities to establish total control in seconds. The elegant music was entirely replaced by the sharp commands of law enforcement. Derek stood completely frozen at the head table. The arrogant CEO who built an empire on lies now looked like a terrified animal. The lead federal agent marched straight down the plush red carpet, his eyes locked onto Derek with unwavering intensity. "Derek Lawson," the agent announced, his voice carrying immense weight. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering." Derek instinctively took a weak step backward, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to formulate a defense, but his silver tongue had completely abandoned him. Two armed agents flanked him immediately, grabbing his tailored arms and forcefully spinning him around. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed perfectly through the silent, watching crowd. The magnificent navy blue suit he wore to project absolute power was instantly wrinkled and pulled out of shape as they marched him roughly down the red carpet. His humiliating downfall was completely public, witnessed by the elite society he so desperately tried to impress. He was not a visionary. He was just a common thief being dragged away in chains. I watched without a single ounce of pity as the federal agents escorted Derek toward the grand exit. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting outside painted the lobby windows in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. He turned his head one last time, looking back over his shoulder toward the center of the ballroom. His eyes met mine, and in that fleeting moment, he finally understood the profound magnitude of his fatal mistake. He had tried to bury a man who spent 40 years building unbreakable foundations. Now he was the one being buried under the crushing weight of a federal indictment that would keep him behind thick steel bars for the rest of his natural life. As the heavy wooden doors closed behind him, sealing his dark fate forever, the atmosphere in the room shifted abruptly. The immediate physical threat of Derek was gone, but the emotional wreckage he left behind was still very much present. My attention slowly shifted down to the marble floor, where Victoria was still collapsed in a heap of emerald green silk. Her perfectly manicured hands clutched frantically at her designer handbag. Her expensive smartphone was vibrating relentlessly against the hard floor, the screen lighting up with an endless barrage of urgent notifications. Through her hysterical, gasping sobs, she managed to swipe the screen and read the incoming messages. The deep, agonizing wail that tore from her throat was a sound of pure, absolute devastation. The bank had not waited for the federal authorities to conclude their spectacular raid. The moment the FBI froze Derek's fraudulent corporate assets, the automated financial tripwires had been triggered. The shadow syndicates and the massive lending institutions had simultaneously moved to collect their debts. Victoria stared at the glowing screen of her phone, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "They took the house," she gasped, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the terrible words. "The bank just seized the Bel Air mansion. The accounts are completely frozen. I have absolutely nothing left." She crawled across the cold, polished floor, her expensive gown dragging through the spilled champagne and the scattered remnants of her ruined celebration. She reached the bottom of the wooden podium and weakly grabbed the tailored hem of my charcoal gray trousers. "Daddy," she wept, the dark mascara running in thick, ugly streams down her pale cheeks. "Daddy, please. You have to help me. I am so terribly sorry for everything we did." Derek forced me into it. He made me sign those papers. I had absolutely no idea it was this bad. Please do not let them take my beautiful home. Do not leave me out on the street. You are my father. You have the farm, you have all that money hidden in the vault. Please just pay the bank. Save me." Her desperate, pleading eyes looked up at me, searching frantically for the unconditional, foolish love that had defined my entire life. She was begging the very man she had gleefully thrown out into the freezing storm just days ago, the man she had coldly threatened to lock inside a padded psychiatric cell. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of her tears was almost too immense to properly comprehend. I looked silently down at the weeping, broken woman clinging desperately to my legs. I felt no sorrow, no lingering paternal instinct to protect her from the storm she had created. The cold wind of the Mojave Desert had completely frozen that part of my heart. I gently but firmly pulled my leg back, forcing her to release her desperate grip on my suit. She reached out one last time, her voice breaking into a pathetic, hollow whimper as she realized the undeniable truth of her new reality. I stared into her terrified eyes and delivered the absolute final blow. "You were right, sweetheart," I whispered coldly, my voice completely devoid of any remaining affection. "That house has too many stairs. It is not safe for you." 1 month later, the chaotic aftermath of that spectacular ballroom raid had finally settled into a quiet, undeniable reality. The federal authorities moved swiftly, freezing every single bank account associated with Vanguard properties and seizing their stolen assets. Derek was sitting in a federal detention center, utterly disgraced, denied bail, and facing decades in federal prison. Meanwhile, Victoria was forced to move into a cheap, run-down motel on the dusty outskirts of the city, completely cut off from the luxurious lifestyle she had so cruelly tried to steal from me. I did not attend the preliminary hearings, nor did I answer the pathetic, desperate letters she sent to my attorney. I was entirely finished with the parasites who had tried to drain my life. Instead, I focused my energy on the magnificent legacy Diane had left behind. With Jonathan's expert legal guidance, I entered into negotiations with a highly respected international green energy firm. They understood the profound value of the Mojave Desert aquifer and wanted to develop a sustainable, environmentally conscious solar and water facility that would genuinely benefit the surrounding communities. We finalized a long-term lease agreement for the exclusive water rights. The final contract transferred $40 million directly into my secure accounts. It was a staggering, almost incomprehensible sum of money, far more than I could ever spend in my remaining years. But I knew exactly what my brilliant, compassionate wife would have wanted me to do with it. I took exactly half of that fortune, $20 million, and established a powerful legal defense fund. I named it the Diane Caldwell Foundation for Elder Justice. I hired a dedicated team of ruthless, top-tier attorneys whose sole mission was to protect vulnerable senior citizens from financial abuse and predatory conservatorships. I wanted to ensure that no older person would ever have to stand trembling in the freezing rain, terrified of being locked in a psychiatric ward by their own greedy children. We provided free, aggressive legal representation to those who had been silenced, turning Diane's final act of protection into a massive nationwide shield for the defenseless. It was the absolute perfect tribute to the remarkable woman who had saved my life from beyond the grave. With my future entirely secure and my heart finally at peace, I decided it was time to truly enjoy the freedom Diane had gifted me. I walked down into the brilliant climate-controlled subterranean vault one last time, admiring the breathtaking collection of classic vehicles. I selected the pristine silver birch Aston Martin, leaving the remaining cars safely guarded by the elite security team who now lived permanently on the heavily fortified property. The powerful engine roared to life with a deep, resonant growl that vibrated perfectly right through my chest. I drove the magnificent masterpiece out of the barren desert and headed straight toward the beautiful California coast. Right now, I am cruising smoothly down the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. The top is down, and the crisp, salty ocean breeze is rushing past my face, carrying away the very last lingering traces of sorrow and betrayal. To my right, the vast, endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean sparkles brilliantly under the warm afternoon sun, the waves crashing rhythmically against the golden beaches and the jagged coastal cliffs. To my left, the winding scenic road stretches out like a ribbon of pure, absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed my spirit just 30 days ago is completely gone. I feel the smooth, polished wood of the classic steering wheel under my calloused hands, and for the first time in a very long time I am smiling. A genuine bright smile that reaches all the way to my eyes. I am 76 years old, but as I shift the gears and feel the incredible surge of power from the vintage engine, I feel like a young man again. I am no longer a victim. I am a survivor who walked through a terrible fire and emerged entirely unbroken. Sometimes I look over at the empty passenger seat, and I can almost see Diane sitting right there beside me wearing her favorite silk scarf, smiling proudly at the man I have become. She gave me the tools to fight back, but more importantly, she gave me the incredible opportunity to start over. The beautiful coastal landscape blurs past me in a magnificent streak of vibrant green and deep blue, reminding me that life is incredibly precious and far too short to spend it surrounded by people who do not truly value your heart. Blood does not make you family. Respect does. Never underestimate the quiet ones who built the world you stand on. We sacrifice our bodies, our time, and our dreams to give our children a much better life. But that unconditional love should never be an open invitation for severe abuse. If someone uses your love as a weapon against you, you have the absolute right to disarm them and walk away forever without looking back. Do you completely agree with how I handled them? Did they get exactly what they deserved? In the end, I truly want to know your thoughts. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me your honest opinion. Let me know which city or country you are listening from today. If my story gave you courage or helped you realize your own worth, you can support this channel by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing you these powerful narratives. It has been a profound journey, and I am entirely grateful to share it with you. Thank you for staying with me through the heavy storm, for listening to my truth, and for supporting the cause of justice. Always remember to protect your peace, stand up for your personal dignity, and never let anyone make you feel like you are entirely finished. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.